Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this year's Huxley lecture. I'm Clive, the president of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and it's great to see so many of you here in this wonderful international conference. I've just got two quick things to say to you. You'll see there are flyers on your chairs for the next conference that the RAI is organising, which is the Anthropology and Photography, which is next May at the British Museum. And this is going to be looking at photography in its broadest sense in our discipline of anthropology. So please put that into your diaries. And secondly, that this is the first of two lectures that our speaker tonight, Howard Morphy, is giving. And the second one is also at the British Museum in London on the 8th of November. You can find out further details about it on the RAI website. Well, the Huxley Medal, which is the highest medal that the Royal Anthropological Institute is able to bestow, is awarded to an anthropologist in acknowledgement of sustained brilliance over a number of years, even decades. This is most certainly the case with this year's Huxley medalist, Professor Howard Morphy. From the very outset of his career, he has enjoyed an international reputation, and his subsequent research and teaching have only confirmed his standing in our profession. Howard studied for his MPhil in London and his PhD at the Australian National University in Canberra. This involved intensive fieldwork with the Yolngu people of northeast Arnhem Land, an area to which he has subsequently returned on many occasions, and which has been the inspiration for many of his books and papers. He was a student of another Huxley medalist, Peter Rucko, who I know would have taken great pride in seeing Howard accept this award, although the way he expressed it would no doubt have been uniquely characteristic. Howard's first job in anthropology was as a curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. From there, he moved to a chair at University College London, and then in 1997 back to ANU to the chair in anthropology that he presently occupies with such distinction, and where he is also director of the Research School of Humanities and Arts. Howard's claim to the Huxley Medal may be restated in many ways, but perhaps the most straightforward is to say that he's re-established the field of visual anthropology at the heart of our discipline. His seminal work, Ancestral Connections, published in 1991, contained a marvellously subtle and evocative description of Aboriginal art that has inspired a generation of anthropologists, many who became attracted by the equal brilliance of his teaching to become his students. And I know many of you are here with us this afternoon, and who have gone on themselves to forge successful careers. Rarely for anthropology has a work been received with such unanimity and instant recognition as a masterpiece. Fred Myers echoed the thoughts of many when he wrote in his review in American Ethnologist, and I quote here, "This is a central reading for students of Aboriginal culture. For the anthropology of art, it is no less significant. Ancestral Connections succeeds in placing cultural forms in the complex space of modernity as neither polluted nor pure, but as genuinely human attempts for a cultural future." The decades that followed have been accompanied by a stream of publications that include articles, reports, edited volumes, and books that have placed Professor Morphy firmly at the forefront of developments in anthropology. These include Rethinking Visual Anthropology with Marcus Banks, a book which is regarded as marking a turning point in visual anthropology, and more recently, Becoming Art, exploring cross-cultural categories. On a personal note, while I've benefited from all these works, it was a short article, Howard, published in 1989 in our journal Man, as it was then, which literally caught my eye. From dull to brilliant, the aesthetics of spiritual power amongst the Yolngu. This opened up a new perspective for all of us studying material culture and trying to understand its properties, past and present. Howard, though, has not just been an extraordinary gifted teacher, curator, researcher, filmmaker, and writer, he's been committed throughout his career, as Myers realized in his review, to overcoming the division between peoples, and especially between the anthropologist and the object of their study, so as to formulate creative, dynamic partnerships that build on our common humanity. He's acted upon this in a practical fashion and in many different ways. For example, with his wife, Frances Morphy, who's here with us today, in preparing the Blue Mud Bay native title claim, which as a result of the 2008 High Court judgment recognised Indigenous ownership. He's also worked with Aboriginal peoples to give them a voice in the way that tourism develops and in the manner in which their work is presented to the public in museums. Furthermore, he took the earliest opportunity to explore the most appropriate ways to present ethnographic data online, working with both the material that he collected and with the earlier findings of Spencer and Baldwin, so that they will all be universally and freely available. In short, in spite of the incessant demands on his time that many academics face, Professor Morphy has combined in one lifetime an enormous, creative, diverse output, one that is profoundly ethically informed and that shows no signs of lessening, one indeed that inspires us all, not just in this country, but globally, which is why this conference was such a fitting venue for his Huxley lecture. Howard, never dull, always brilliant, is a beacon to us all. I can think of no more fitting recipient of this, our greatest honour, the Huxley Medal. Howard. I now call on Howard. He's going to make a brief response to me, and then he's going to give his lecture, Extended Lives in Global Spaces, the Anthropology of Yolngu Pre-Burial Ceremonies. Howard, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll go back to my first slide there. A bit overwhelming. I'm deeply honoured to receive the Huxley Medal. If I merit it, it's because I've been extremely fortunate in my life as an anthropologist in having exceptional teachers, colleagues, and students, and three wonderful, though fairly privileged, universities: University College London, the Australian National University, and Oxford. And anthropology at all three share in common their breadth. They all make it possible to work across the three of the four fields of anthropology: biological anthropology, socio-cultural anthropology, and archaeology. Linguistics is present in all three universities too, and perhaps my greatest fortune is to have been able to share my life and research with a linguistic anthropologist, Frances Morphy. As an undergraduate at University College London, I had the benefit of two introductory courses to social anthropology, or to anthropology, and Leslie Aiello's lecture that introduced this conference resonates here. One of them was called The Analysis of Culture, and it was taught by Darrell Ford, and the textbook, in effect, was Kroeber's Anthropology Today. Basically, the course could have been at an American university. And the other was taught by Ewan Lewis as an introduction to social anthropology, and used Beattie's Other Cultures, which provided a wonderful introduction to British social anthropology, partly because for a textbook it was very theoretically engaged. The consequences of this dual introduction is that I've always been happy with the concepts of culture, social structure, and social organisation. And central to my life as a student was the Royal Anthropological Institute, without which I would have never become the anthropologist I am. As an undergraduate, we worked most days in the RAI library at Bedford Square, where it was then. It was somewhere that had one of the first coffee machines, I imagine, in life. Was ideal. You were also allowed to smoke. It was in effect our library. Through the RAI Arts panel, and the ethnographic film panel, it broadened our engagement with anthropology. In fact, the RAI has often moved into niches that the anthropological profession has left behind and subsequently regretted, or it's been ahead in many ways. And for a very long-established institution with a great history, it's continued to be a very dynamic presence in anthropology. And without the librarian, Brownlee Kirkpatrick's bending of the RAI's library rules, I would probably not have written my master's thesis, but that's a story for another day. As a graduate student at UCL and ANU, I had 4 remarkable supervisors: Phyllis Cabery, Peter Ucko, Anthony Forge, and John Mulvaney, and an examiner in Nancy Munn, who really helped me convert my thesis into a book. And for the last 40 years, we've worked with Yolngu people who have been friends, relatives, teachers, have understood what anthropologists do and encouraged us to use our research for their benefits. So I'm deeply honoured to have received this quite wonderful medal and a little overwhelmed. But now I will give the Huxley Memorial Lecture. And I'm going to begin with a sort of little preamble that will, in fact, eventually form a text if this lecture is ever podcasted. Because this lecture is being screened live and may later on be accessible on the internet, Yolngu people may be seeing this lecture. The lecture is in part about the lives of 2 distinguished Yolngu women, Dr. Marika and Ms. Yunupingu, who have passed away, and it will contain some images of them. For this reason, I won't be using the names by which they were referred to in their daily life, and Yolngu Korotu need to know that photographs of them will be shown. In 1928, at Milingimbi, and this is a photograph of Milingimbi Mission Station, a Warramiri clansman lay dying. Relatives gathered around him, singing clan songs about the ancestral whale, guiding his spirit back to the spiritual domain. At Gulkala, in 2013, a woman of the Gumait clan lay dying, and her relatives gathered around her. They too sang songs about the ancestral whale. I know about the first event because the anthropologist Lloyd Warner chose it as an example of Yolngu mortuary rituals for his monograph, A Black Civilization. I know about the second because I read about it in an obituary of the renowned Yolngu artist, Ms. Yunupingu, who died in 2012 and whose death was mourned in Australia and in many other places. Those 2 events spanned the period of intense European colonisation of the Yolngu people, their transition from hunters and gatherers on the tropical coast of northeast Arnhem Land to full legal incorporation within the state of Australia. The simple frame of this lecture is a concern with understanding continuity and change, but it's also about the history of anthropology and anthropological theory. To an extent, the anthropology of the Yolngu can be used as a microcosm of the history of anthropology. Few other societies have been so consistently researched by anthropologists from their European colonial moment until the present. Francis Morphy and I began our own research among the Yolngu people at Yirrkala in 1973, 40 years ago. The mission station at Yirrkala had only been established 40 years before that. To us as young field workers, that seemed to be a very long time, a time before the war when the mission was served by a monthly boat and missionaries dressed as people from the past. We did not have an ethnography of the missionaries written in the time of Warner. If we had done, it would have brought them closer. We would have had a measure of their change. But we did have Warner's rich ethnography of the Yolngu, or Merngin as he referred to them. And that did bring us close to Yolngu people of 40 years before, and they did not seem so distant in time. Much of Warner's account rang true to us. Although the missionaries, in a sense, are more directly our ancestors than the Yolngu are, Yolngu people knew the missionaries much better than we did, and the missionaries were more part of their world than of ours. Our cultural memory over the longue durée connects us to a past that includes the missionaries and World War II, European colonial expansion, Christianity, the Magna Carta, paintings from Lascaux. The Yolngu longue durée intersects in places, but the intersections have very different consequences and create very different cultural memories. Yolngu memory of the past, as we will see, gives the Macassans a very prominent place. It doesn't take much to show why they might have a strong presence in memory. For 200 or 300 years before European colonisation of Northern Australia, Aboriginal people had engaged in trade with the Macassans on an annual basis. Yolngu exchanged names with Macassans, worked with them, visited Macassar, spoke their language, and benefited greatly from trade goods. The Macassans were incorporated within the Yolngu symbolic universe. Some Yolngu song cycles provide an almost ethnographic account of the Macassan way of life. And the coast of Arnhem Land is rich with the archaeological record from the Macassans, the campsites, the trepang processing areas, the debris of centuries of contact. And this is a crayon drawing done in 1946 by Mungrawi Yunupingu, the father of Ms. Yunupingu. And that's a crayon drawing of the town of Macassar, beautifully documented, that relates in detail. It's a schematic form of the structure of the town and different aspects of it. I can't go into it in any detail, but it shows the sense in which Yolngu cultural memory had an extraordinarily rich account, which carries on to the present day of those moments of interaction. But what happened? In 1907, the boats stopped coming because an Australia that had no existence for the Yolngu until that point in time ended the Macassan voyages, turning the boats back. It must have had a tremendous impact on Yolngu people, who for centuries had organised their annual economic and ceremonial cycle, in part around the visit of the Macassans. This rift took place a mere 20 years before Lloyd Warner's fieldwork at Milingimbi, and 30 years before the mission station at Yirrkala was established. To us today, in our middle age, late middle age, being optimistic, 40 years ago seems very close. Our memory of this time is aided by our field notes, photographs and films, and through the shared memories of those who were with us then and are with us today. Our analysed ethnography enables us to make sense of Yolngu society as it is today, and Warner's ethnography still rings true and still makes sense of most aspects of Yolngu society, even though that society has changed in dramatic ways. This tells us something about what anthropology can do, what kind of knowledge anthropologists can produce, and how useful that knowledge can be. The ethnographic present of anthropology should represent societies in their dynamic mode. A good dynamic ethnography provides insights into subsequent changes. Ethnographic analysis lies at the heart of this lecture, but there can be no separation of theory from analysis in anthropology. The main theoretical concepts that underpin my research can be viewed as a cluster of related ideas that fit easily within the long-term discourse over theory and anthropology, and they continue across divisions between different national anthropologies. They're influenced by an underlying premise that action in the present is determined by multiple factors that operate at different levels. The theoretical ideas that have recurred in my work from its beginning include the concepts of relative autonomy, the nexus between structure and agency, an emphasis on expressive forms, art, music, song, poetry, as significant ways of acting in the world, and an emphasis on the importance of value-creating processes in influencing the trajectory of change. Key words that enter this theoretical dialogue include recursivity, contingency, articulation, trajectory, emergence, reflecting an emphasis on the dynamic and processual aspects of human societies. And having used the word society, I need to emphasize that my boundaries are always fuzzy and change is ever present. In understanding continuities and change over time, the concept of relative autonomy is a useful one. For example, in the Yolngu case, Certain historical factors have clearly had a major impact on their society. And from the local point, they're relatively autonomous in origin. The fact that the Macassans stopped coming, ending a trading relation of 300 years in duration, the arrival of the missionaries, the dialogue with Christianity, and the process of sedentarization that followed. European attitudes to hygiene and the dead meant that it became no longer possible to dig up the remains of the deceased and place their bones in bark coffins. Such factors in their different ways have had a major impact on the Yolngu world as it was, and have required adjustments and change. Within Yolngu society itself, certain features of social organisation can be seen to be relatively autonomous and have remained continuing anchoring points within the trajectory of change. The division of the universe into two moieties, Dua and Yiricha, provides one example. Yolngu moieties are exogamous and patrilineal, and in many respects all-encompassing. The world is divided on the basis of the moieties. Animal species belong to one moiety or the other. The ancestral beings who created the land are either Dua or Yiricha, and hence the land itself is either Dua or Yiricha. Moieties are reinforced constantly in the enactment of kinship relations, in the performance of rituals, and in the avoidance of incest. The world is almost unthinkable without the moiety division, and its value has continued to be reproduced through interaction with the encompassing colonial society. In educating outsiders about their world, Yolngu will foreground the division into two. In introducing Yolngu religious iconography into the Akala Mission Church, Yolngu painted two panels to be placed on either side of the altar, one Dua, one Yiricha. And these are the panels as they were set up in the Akala Church in 1962, and we have the Dua moiety panel there and the Yiricha moiety panel there. It was at the suggestion of a Yolngu elder there, Nerichin Meimaru, who, when I stop being director of the Research School of Humanities and the Arts, I will be writing a biography of him, that the Reverend Edgar Wells agreed to put these Yolngu paintings on either side of the church. It's not always been easy, and indeed, although those panels were there when Francis and I first began our fieldwork in 1973, by the time we finished doing our fieldwork 3 years later, 1976, the panels were actually under the church because a more fundamentalist missionary had decided that they were dangerous heathen objects and should be removed. Yolngu rescued them, and today they are in a little chapel of their own in the Yolngu Museum and Art Centre. In petitioning Parliament a year later, in 1963, in a gesture that played a significant role in gaining land rights for Aboriginal people, Yolngu produced not one but two bark petitions, Dua and Yiricha, and the bark petitions today reside beside a copy of the Magna Carta in Parliament House, projecting Yolngu moieties onto the national stage. Value creation processes within groups, organisations and societies always involve engagement or entanglement with the outside. Yolngu have lived for several hundred years in juxtaposition with societies very different from their own. Over 200 years of interaction with the Macassans has been followed by almost a century of increasingly close involvement with Europeans. Yolngu have developed over recent years what we might call their own meta-theory of articulation, the concept of two-way or both ways, most explicitly developed in the sphere of education. In schooling, Yolngu and European systems of knowledge are conceived of as being separate but relatable. Individuals can learn to act through both. I'll be coming back to that later. Two-way is always dialogical, a dialogue in which the individual members of particular societies are engaged in value creation processes within their own society and in relation to the wider world. These value creation processes are always dynamic at the same time as they're recursive. looking backwards in order to go forward, as my Yolngu friend Narichin Mamoru said. The core of this lecture concerns a recently developed Yolngu ceremonial form, so recent that Yolngu refer to it only by the English term memorial service. My aim in analysing these kinds of ceremonies is twofold: to interpret their significance in the context of the articulation of Yolngu society with the Australian state, and to show how and why the ceremonies take the form they do. Each ceremony is an exemplar of a category which has no prescribed form. Each event is different. I hope I'll be able to show, though, that each ceremony is meaningful in different ways to different communities and to different individuals, and that this is indeed the intention of those who orchestrate the event. Memorial services are held when a Yolngu person with a major national reputation dies. And I'll focus on two that Francis Morphy and I have attended. Both were held in memory of distinguished Yolngu women. The first, in 2008, was held for Dr. Marika, a Yolngu educationalist. And the second was in June 2012 for the artist, healer, and Bible translator, Masuna Pingu. The primary reason Yolngu give for holding a memorial service is to enable non-Yolngu who will not be able to attend the person's funeral to pay their respects and to take part in a celebration of the person's life. Yolngu funerals are highly political events, and on occasions, months can pass before the various issues involved in deciding the form and location of the ceremony can be resolved. Until that point, the person's body will be kept in the local hospital morgue or in a portable mortuary. The advantage of a memorial ceremony is the date can be fixed and outsiders can make their plans to attend. The flexibility enables Yolngu to keep their public responsibilities separate from their internal negotiations over the death. Now, before turning in more detail to the form of the ceremonies, I'll introduce briefly the people whose lives were celebrated. Both biographies illustrate the complex nature of Yolngu engagement with the outside world and of the value creation processes that are involved. Dr. Marika was born in 1957. She was the daughter of Roy Marika, one of the leaders in the Yolngu people's successful struggle for land rights. She was educated at Giacala Mission School and Dupama College, a short-lived secondary boarding school set up for Aboriginal children from across Arnhem Land. It was while at high school that she and other young Yolngu developed the concept of two-way education. In essence, the framing of education recognises the relative autonomy of Yolngu and European systems of knowledge. It advocates teaching them separately, but in an environment where they can come together for mutual benefit. The philosophy was built around the metaphor of garnma, the process whereby fresh water and salt water come together and become highly potent. It was no coincidence that an image symbolizing garnma was chosen to illustrate Dr. Marika's memorial program, the ceremony program. In this case, a stone fish trap in a tidal river mouth. The fish trap had been recreated as part of a school project, one of many that Dr. Marika led to help build up the school's Yolngu curriculum. And just in case people are intrigued in how this stone fish trap works, what happens is that people will build this low dam of stones across the river mouth. When the tide comes in, the fish are all sort of this side. When the tide comes out, they can't get past this effective weir, and people then can go and easily spear them or pick them up and so on and so forth. Dr. Marika became widely acclaimed in Australian educational circles as a leader in the theory and practice of bilingual and bicultural education. She was also a highly skilled translator, able to convey the poetics of Yolngu song poetry in English and to articulate clearly the similarities and differences between abstract concepts in Yolngu and in English. Her translation of Yolngu artists' documentation of their paintings, which she began first of all as a schoolgirl, have been acknowledged as literary works. Dr. Marika became a council member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies and Torres Strait Islanders and a member of the Board of Reconciliation Australia. She was one of the people invited to Prime Minister Rudd's 2020 forum to discuss future directions of Australian society, and she was present at the apology when Prime Minister Rudd apologised for the stolen generation. And this is a photograph of here of her with the then and present Prime Minister. One of the great, she was awarded honorary doctorates by Charles Darwin University and posthumously by the Australian National University. She died while out on country with relatives collecting shellfish the day before she was supposed to go to Adelaide for a heart valve replacement. One of the great ironies of her life was that though she gained national renown as an educationalist, the programs that she helped create in her local domain at the Yirrkala School were perpetually under threat from the Northern Territory government, which against prevailing educational theory continued to attack bilingual and bicultural education. At the time of her death, the Northern Territory government had in effect closed down the two-way education program. Had she lived a little longer, she would have been pleased to say it had been reinstated as a result of Yolngu resistance. The children in their entirety had simply stopped attending school. Ms. Yunupingu was born in 1943, the daughter of Mungarawi Yunupingu, whose drawing I showed earlier, leader of the Gumait clan and a renowned Yolngu artist. Her brothers, Galaroi and Dr. Yunupingu, have both been Australians of the Year. Ms. Yunupingu was educated at Yirrkala Mission School. As a young woman, she married Mutichboy Munungor and had 5 children. When I first met her in 1974, she was working with missionary linguist Joyce Ross, translating the Bible into the Gumait language. Ms. Yunupingu came closely involved with the annual Gama Festival, founded by her brother, Dr. Yunupingu. The Gama Festival is a major annual event introducing visitors to Yolngu culture and has become a national forum for the discussion of Indigenous policy matters. Ms. Yunupingu led the women's program for the festival, out of which grew a healing centre in which traditional medical treatments were applied to Yolngu and non-Yolngu patients alike. She'd long been involved in artwork. Producing narrative paintings in a naive, figurative style. In 2000, she developed a new painting style based on clusters of star-shaped figures covering the entire surface of the bark, producing a vibrant and modulating overall image. The core figure of the star is associated with the Yirritja moiety and occurs in a number of paintings by her father. While she acknowledged this link to Yolngu iconography, she also generalized the meaning of her paintings to encompass universal themes, common humanity, sharing the same universe. The new style proved successful, and in 2004, Ms. Yunupingu won the major Aboriginal Art Prize, the Telstra Award, for an installation of 3 hololog coffins. She quickly became one of the most widely recognised Aboriginal artists while continuing with all her other activities. She was one of the artists commissioned to produce works for incorporation in the fabric of the administration buildings of the Musée de Quai Branly in Paris. And here she is at the opening of that museum. Her final major work was a huge painted wooden sculpture in the form of a Macassan sail, mounted in the entrance hall of a new building for the College of Asia and Pacific at the Australian National University. She chose the theme deliberately to emphasise the long history of relationships between Australia and Eastern Indonesia, as perceived through the Yolngu longue durée. We'll see the final print she produced later in this lecture. You can't really get the scale of this, but we have here the bark painting that she originally did as a sort of maquette for this very large sail that is now in the Bull building. And this indeed was itself made in sections in Yirrkala, painted by her and then brought back to Canberra. Right, the dynamics of Yolngu mortuary rituals over time. Returning to my prefatory comments, I'll now briefly review the changing nature of Yolngu mortuary rituals since the mission stations were established in the 1920s and 30s. In the 1930s, Yolngu practiced primary, secondary and tertiary disposal of the remains of the dead. When a death could be anticipated because of illness or severe injury, the ritual process began and still does begin when the person was alive. In the past, primary burial was performed within a day or so of the person's death. The body, now this is not the body of a deceased person, this is the body of a young boy who's being prepared for his circumcision ceremony. But the paintings are identical to the paintings that were painted on people following their deaths. The painting body was painted with elaborate designs representing a clan's sacred well, Manguchi, to which their soul, the person's soul, was being guided. 6 to 12 months later, the bones were dug up, cleaned and placed in a bark container. This was moved from camp to camp and placed on a platform for safekeeping. After a number of years had passed, the bones were placed in a larakich, a hollow log coffin, which was erected in a burial ground where it remained in place until finally it disintegrated. And you can see 2 hollow log coffins there being prepared in Yirrkala in 1946. One Yiricha moiety, one Dua moiety. Okay, the sequence of rituals associated with death had overlapping themes. First, the return of the soul of the dead person to the ancestral dimension, when it becomes a resource to animate new life. Second, coming to terms with the death emotionally and through the affirmation and reordering of relationships among the living. The journey of the soul is a central theme of ceremonies connected with death and is enacted through the sequence of ritual events. To simplify matters greatly, the ritual process involves creating chains of connection that link ancestral beings on a journey from the place of death, where the body lies, to the place where the soul is being directed. The ancestral beings concerned are of the same moiety as the person who died and are linked to the person by kinship. It's not envisaged that the reincorporation of the soul is completed by the first interment. It occurs over an extended time. In the years following European colonization, there have been significant changes in the form, structure, and duration of mortuary rituals. In 1935, the actual process of disposal extended over many years. In subsequent years, there's been a shift of focus from the mortal remains. However, the ritual process remains an extended one. Some of those changes can be seen as substitutional, with possessions replacing bones. Overall, rituals surrounding primary burial have increased in importance and in duration. Introduced technology, enabling bodies to be held for weeks or even months in a mortuary, has enabled the negotiations that follow a death to be extended and maximising the attendance. Our research on the changes in Yolngu mortuary rituals over time shows that almost no element is constantly present, yet the trajectory has an overall coherence. Yolngu continually make reconnections with the past as part of a recursive dialogue, incorporating existing elements in new ways and introducing new components or even new events. Changes in the treatment of the body at primary burial provide a clear-cut example. In Warner and Donald Thompson's time, a central component was the painting of the dead person's chest. In the mission context, the practice was discouraged. One of the most moving experiences it's not the right moment to pause. One of the most moving experiences in my initial field trip in 1973 occurred when I visited Millingimby. I was accompanied by the Reverend Edgar Wells. Wells had been superintendent at Millingimby for a decade in the 1950s, played a major role in the Yolngu struggle for land rights. I was 2 weeks into my research, and Wells was introducing me to a group of senior men outside the house of Jawa, a community leader. An old man was resting on the ground. He spoke in a very animated way, and Jawa translated. The old man was approaching death. It was time to die, but he was afraid to die without the paintings of his clan well on his chest. He was asking Edgar Wells to intercede with the current missionary and allow the painting to be done before his burial. The following year, we began our fieldwork at Yokala. It appeared that Yolngu had resolved the problem themselves. People no longer painted the chest of the person, but produced paintings on a coffin lid. The coffin was incorporated in dance sequences, and the painting marked crucial stages in the journey of the soul. However, not long after that, coffin paintings ceased to be produced, and in subsequent years it's possible to see a series of different elements substituting for the chest and then the coffin painting. On some occasions, a cloth was painted with designs linked to the person's clan and laid on top of the coffin. Bark paintings with an appropriate design might be placed on the side of the shade. On the death of a renowned clan leader, I was approached by his son to see if I could organize the production of a cloth made up of designs from one of his father's paintings. I was able to persuade the photo workshop of the Australian National University that would be an appropriate gesture, and the cloth was produced, the cloth around which his body was wrapped. The innovations all share something in common with the painting of the body in that they include designs that can be connected to the person's ancestral inheritance. But it would be mistaken to see them as simple substitutions. These innovative actions fit in with the logic of mortuary rituals. They fit in with the aspirations of the participants and the core themes that the mortuary ritual engages: the expression of grief, the destiny of the soul, the expression of kinship and relationships. Such gestures all have recursive elements and simultaneously incorporate changes. Bark paintings have in the past been used in revelatory rituals, and today are one of the main products made by Yolngu for sale. Cloth had been one of the main goods exchanged with the Macassans and continues to have a strong association with them. Paintings on cloth made by women as shrouds for bodies of close kin reflected the fact that women today produce clan paintings for sale that in the past were the exclusive domain of men. The shift from the body to the coffin lid to the cloth painting, an activity exclusively engaged in by women, provides a moment when women can exercise their agency in new ways. Now, we've now sketched the background to Yolngu mortuary memorial services, sufficient detail for them to make sense to us. We can see where they come from and how they fit in to the evolving Yolngu world. We've seen mortuary rituals as an ever-changing dynamic complex, which can incorporate new rituals, new events, new components at almost every level. Yolngu can produce a ritual for almost every eventuality. The corollary of this is that any new events added to this complex have recursive references to the past and overlap in their themes with components of other ceremonies that will be held in a process of forgetting, remembering, and transformation. Yolngu people who are honoured with memorial services will have a number of other ceremonies performed that are primarily focused on their death. The memorial services are not burial ceremonies. Although they are inevitably concerned with and reference the fate of the soul, they're not structured to guide the soul to the clan well. They are concerned with genealogy and with a person's place in the world, more generally, and unlike burial, include on an almost equal basis performances associated with both moieties. The organisation of the two ceremonies we attended both reflected the typical role structures of mortuary rituals, but in different ways. In both cases, the ceremonies alternated speeches made by distinguished Yolngu and non-Yolngu, and musical and dance performances. The invited speakers reflected the main themes of the person's life and their areas of renown in the world. So I'll begin with Dr. Marika's memorial service. Dr. Marika's memorial service was attended by a large congregation who assembled in front of open sheds specifically constructed at Yirrkala for mortuary rituals. The service began dramatically with the arrival by vehicle of the coffin containing her body. The coffin was conveyed to an enclosed space to the right of the stage. The episode was performed by dancers, reenacting the journey to Yolngu of two ancestral women, the Jankau sisters, who created the landscape there. That was in Dr. Marika's clan country. And there, these ancestral women gave birth to the people who succeeded them in their land. When the coffin was in place, close friends and relatives were invited in to view it. This provided the occasion for people to place items closely associated with her beside the coffin. The setting had been created for the memorial service to begin. A photograph of Roy Marika. I better just move for a second. Actually, we'll see it in a minute. It's a bit dark here. The photograph of Roy Marika is just about there. The image that I'll refer you to here is this bark painting here, which is a painting of the creative actions of the ancestral women at Yolngu. It is the place where they gave birth. It's precisely the kind of painting that would have been put on a person's chest or the coffin lid. That is where her body lies, and you'll see it in the next photograph. Here, someone you might recognise. There is Roy Marika. Here is where her body lies. These on either side are the sacred walking sticks of the Jankau sisters, these ancestral women, who used them both to create features of the landscape and in the process of their birthing. So we see here, in a sense, this setup, which I will now go to describe. A photograph of Roy Marika, Dr. Marika's father, was on the left of on the stage, next to where her coffin had been placed. Included within the frame was the MBE, Member of the British Empire, that he'd been awarded for his contribution to Indigenous land rights. There was a lectern in the centre of the stage, on either side of which were the two ceremonial digging sticks of the Jankau sisters. A ceremonial bati, or basket, representing the baskets that the Jankau sisters carried, was placed on the lectern. To the left of the stage was a painting of the sand dunes at Yolngu, a variant of the painting that in the past would have been painted on her body. The objects were not interpreted to the non-Yolngu congregation. The non-Yolngu audience, however, would be able to place them in a familiar frame of the pulpit of a church adorned for an important occasion. Dr. Marika's national role was reflected in the presence of a number of senior government representatives among the speakers. The Labour Senator for the Northern Territory, Trish Crossan, the local federal member, Warren Snowden, who was the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence, Science and Personnel. But more important than that, in his early life, he was a teacher in the Northern Territory who was quite close to Ray Mitchell as a friend. And Jenny Macklin, the Minister for Family, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs. Other speakers included representatives from Reconciliation Australia, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, Australian universities and educationalists, the Uniting Church, the Deemaroo Aboriginal Corporation, the Indigenous Land Management Organisation that she'd helped to set up, business enterprises ranging from the local arts centre to Rio Tinto, the international mining conglomerate, which owns the local bauxite mine. The music that was performed reflected Dr. Marika's own eclectic preferences and her religious background. However, it also distanced the memorial service from the traditional manikai that would be the primary performance genre at her actual burial ceremony. After her coffin was put in place, Elvis Presley's version of Bridge Over Troubled Waters and Memories were played. Dr. Marika had indeed been to Graceland. Hymns included To God Be the Glory, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, and Cliff Richard's Millennium version of the Lord's Prayer. Yolngu songs linked to her own Ririchingu clan and her mother's Gumaich clan, but they were performed by the rock group Yoto Yindi, made out of young musicians from the two related clans. Other performances included the local Tongan Youth Brass Band and recordings of contemporary Yolngu Christian songs accompanied by innovative dance forms performed by teams of young girls. And the concluding procession was accompanied by Joan Baez's Forever Young. While in some respects the memorial ceremonies are planned with outside participants in mind, the events are as much for Yolngu participants as for the visitors. A printed program is produced for the event, but it's indicative rather than being an actual schedule. Two different kinds of performances are combined within a single event. The speeches given by Yolngu relatives and distinguished non-Yolngu visitors, and the dance sequences performed by different Yolngu groups. These types of performance are subject to different constraints. In the case of Dr. Marika's memorial ceremony, an event that was timetabled to last for 3 hours in the end took twice as long. While the organisers suggested the visitors kept their contributions to a limited time, 5 minutes or so, similar time constraints could not, 3 minutes I think, to apply to Yolngu performers. Planes were waiting at the local airport to transport the politicians away, and they had to leave by mid-afternoon. The politician staff became increasingly anxious as the deadline approached, torn between offending the Yolngu organisers and delaying the affairs of state. Eventually, people discovered that all they had to do was ask to be moved up the schedule, and that could be done without offending anybody. The non-Yolngu speeches were not coordinated with the Yolngu performances. The Yolngu performances had to follow a particular order, but from the Yolngu perspectives, the outsiders could be positioned anywhere. Muzuna Pingu's memorial service. Dr. Marika's death was sudden and unexpected. Although she had lived with serious health problems for much of her life, Muzuna Pingu knew she was dying of cancer and had prepared for her own death while she continued to participate energetically in life. I'm going to go forward one. The last work of art that she produced was a print that was produced as an image on the front of the program for her memorial service. The print was an image in the naive style of her earlier work and showed the artist to the left with people gathering around her, as people do when they know a person is entering the last stages of life on earth. Her obituary, written by Will Stubbs, the manager of Bukulangai Mulka Art Centre, recounts the final stages of her illness, when she lay apparently in a coma in Nhulunbuy Hospital. Yolngu women in mourning keen the words of sacred clan songs. A recording had been made of Muzuna Pingu's elder sister and fellow artist, Gaimala, at an exhibition opening a decade earlier, shortly before Gaimala's own death. And Stubbs writes, as she lay in a coma in Nhulunbuy Hospital, surrounded by her keening sisters, she stirred, and a niece placed a mobile phone recording on her pillow next to her head. Ms. Yunupingu joined her sister in keening the milk-carry, though remaining unconscious. And of course, that event was captured on a mobile phone too. Although we were not present, Ms. Yunupingu's daughter called Frances that day, and the phone was placed on the pillow so that Frances too could say her final words to her. The program of the memorial service condenses important themes of her life, reaching out to the non-Yolngu world and simultaneously reflecting on her identity as a Yolngu woman. The English texts are an exegesis on her paintings of the night sky, emphasizing the fact that people share the same universe and giving a perspective on the relationship between life and death that accommodates both Yolngu and Christian beliefs. Her self-portrait might need a caption to be interpreted to the non-Yolngu present, though in itself it's an affecting image. The name she is given would be unfamiliar, not names people would have heard her referred to in public before. They are likan, sacred names associated with the Gumaich clan's ancestral heritage. On death, the names by which a person was referred to in everyday life are repressed for a while. Hence, in the program, her everyday name was not included, though her family acknowledged that this name would continue to be used in the outside world. Ms. Yunupingu's service had a different emphasis to Dr. Marika's, a much stronger local focus. The ceremony was held at Gunyangara community where she'd lived. A lectern was set up in the centre of the stage. On either side were banners with Christian texts. On the left, a passage from St. John's Gospel. On the right, the Lord's Prayer in Yolngu Mata. The back of the stage was hung with printed cloths based on Ms. Yunupingu's star design. The National Gallery of Australia had asked her family what an appropriate gift might be. They requested a length of cloth with her design printed on it, and the National Gallery commissioned it from a Canberra printer. The cloth was used in various different ways in the ceremonies that followed her death. The dominant colour in the ceremony was yellow, the colour of ochre, the colour of the ochre of the Yiricha moiety. The main non-Yolngu speakers were people associated with the Uniting Church and the Australian art world. Her art dealer Beverly Knight, the owner of the Alcaston Gallery in Melbourne, spoke, as did representatives of the National Gallery in Canberra. Many of the speakers were connected to the church and emphasised the role that she played and played by missionary linguists who, from the 1950s on, had worked with Yolngu on Bible translations. Other speakers were the member for the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly and Frances Morphy, who had been adopted as a daughter of hers in the early years of our fieldwork. The memorial service began with a procession of the surviving children of Ms. Yunupingu's father, Mungarau Yunupingu, a walk of honour by the remaining brothers and sisters, since this was how it was presented in the programme. We're told that this was to show where she came from. It was both sad and moving, since so many had died. There was a palpable sense of loss and vulnerability among those who remained. The dance performances then alternated with speeches including evangelical Christian songs, Yolngu manikai in contemporary genres. The song performances fitted in with the broad themes of Yolngu mortuary rituals in many different ways. Irrespective of whether they were Yolngu or Christian songs, their performance was seen by Yolngu as a gift to the body. The performance belonged to clans related to Ms. Yunupingu, just as in the case of actual burial ceremonies, it was important for people to be able to demonstrate their relationships to her and express their feelings. It was important that they should be allowed to do so, or we were told this would result in trouble. To quote one of her classificatory daughters, the performances are to show where she comes from. It is a jigsaw that fits all the pieces together. But if people are missing, if a piece of the jigsaw is missing, you will find you are in real trouble at the actual burial ceremony. This was given as an explanation as to why the memorial services tended to run over time. I'll give an example of one of the dance sequences that was performed to show how it fits into the structure of the ceremony. And I'll talk about it before I show it, but just to accompany that, I will show that actually this is got slightly out of sequence. These are the brothers and sisters walking up to the stage. These are Yolngu people recording the event in a contemporary manner. So I'll give some exegesis on the performance that you're going to see shortly. The song style is one developed in Eastern Island land as a contemporary musical form. The words of the songs are variants on the verses of Yolngu clan Manikai. However, rather than being sung, accompanied by bilma, clapping sticks, and yerdaki didgeridoo, the music is influenced by Western popular music and evangelical Christian forms. Its reception outside Arnhem Land has been remarkable, this musical genre, and Gurumul Yunupingu, a former member of the Yoto Yindi rock group, has become one of Australia's leading popular singers at the moment. Traditional Yolngu Manikai, or songs, comprise a series of short verses which together trace the trajectory of a particular ancestral being or set of ancestral beings across the country. Each verse is sung a number of times with intervals between. The song cycle ends at a particular location that is central to that spiritual being's existence. In burial ceremonies, the sequences of songs is one of the mechanisms whereby the soul is guided back to the clan well. Now, parts of a number of song cycles associated with different ancestral beings will be sung, and the spirit is symbolically associated with different ancestral beings along the way. Now, this contemporary song genre is built up on repeated sequences, and indeed, in this case, does follow the ancestral journey from place to place. And the dance sequence I filmed lasts over 6 minutes, and I've edited it down to 3. The song's a new version of a Galpu clan song. Her mother was Galpu, and the words were modified to include reference to her, some in English, most in Yolngu. The song is about Witich, or Baiwara, the Galpu snake. Now, the snake is associated with the coming of the wet season, thunder, lightning, torrential rainstorms. The hand movements of the dancers represent, among other things, lightning and falling rain. In the final dance movement, you'll see the dancers circle around each other before forming a circle in the ground. This represents the sacred water hole on Gulbula Island, linked to the origins of the yerdaki, the didgeridoo itself. The movements of the dancers reference a series of other episodes linked to the snake. On 2 occasions, another song line intervenes. Marna, the shark, and the hunters who speared him rather intervene. Rather than being separated by intervals, the events are woven into a whole. So we'll now keep our fingers crossed and play.
I heard my mother from the long distance making me cry. Young and dead. My mother dreaming, the storm clouds building across the sky. Whoa.
Amazing what you can do with an iPhone these days. Now, I'm going to skip the next section to go on to the conclusion, so I better very quickly explain. This photograph is of Yolngu of the Galpu clan, Gary Dorkai, who tragically died, and that particular song performance that we just saw in dance performance was originally composed for his actual burial ceremony and is now being used in this different context. And I'll now read the conclusion. The Yolngu Memorial Service has been developed in response to the post-colonial context. It's not an adaptation or a replacement of pre-existing ritual events. Rather, it's an addition to the complex of mortuary rituals and exemplifies the ways in which Yolngu society is reproduced in continuity with the past, yet at the same time responds to new situations in innovative ways. While initially Lloyd Warner, returning to the field, would find Yolngu living in a world that was almost unrecognizable, it would not take him long to see features of the events that made perfect sense. He'd recognize the strength of the moiety division, the respective roles taken by different clans and in the performance. The idea of a good death, the role played by the dying person in the process, the central role played by mortuary rituals in the society, and the intense politics that comes to the fore following a senior person's death. He would see the same avoidance relationships manifest in people's behaviour towards one another and would be able to recognise the clan songs, dances and paintings performed or produced in the actual burial ceremony. He would almost certainly have been surprised that Yolngu had gained title to their land, continued to speak their languages, and that their cultural forms had gained widespread recognition in Australia and overseas. Yet at the same time, he would have had the basis for understanding how this might be possible. Warner's choice of a black civilization as the title of his book was an explicit reference to the value creation processes he, as an anthropologist, was engaged in. He would have been aware of the history of Yolngu engagement with outsiders and understood the role of the Macassans and the missionaries in the Yolngu longue durée. He also understood the nexus of relationships that linked Yolngu ritual practices and social organisation to a belief in the determining nature of the ancestral powers located in land. That I can, with some confidence, attribute such understandings to Warner is a reflection of how relevant Warner's analysis of Yolngu society 80 years ago is to my understanding of Yolngu society today. At the same time, I can anticipate where he would see changes. Not so much in the surface form of people's dress, in their use of iPads and mobile phones, but in subtle modifications of gender roles, in the reduced level of polygamy, in the greater emphasis on patrilineal clan as a unit of affiliation. Whether Warner would have had the means to quickly understand the memorial service from the Yolngu perspective, but the majority of today's non-Yolngu participants do not have that knowledge. Nonetheless, the ceremony clearly works for them as an experiential event and, in Dr. Marika's case, enabled the production by the ABC of a podcast radio program, largely comprising the formal speeches. The memorials are in effect two performances with different audiences in mind, yet are integrated into a whole. Yolngu and those who have learnt about Yolngu society would understand the performances in a very different way from those who did not share that knowledge. In Dr. Marika's ceremony, the strong reference to the Jankau sisters, the ancestral women who created her clan country and gave birth to the people who occupied it, was something that all Yolngu present would have understood, but few non-Yolngu would have been aware of its significance. Yet the formal setting of the stage, the aesthetics of the performance were widely accessible, and indeed the musical forms are created out of multiple cross-cultural influences. The aesthetics of the performance are integral to the process of persuasion that I've argued has been central to Yolngu gaining recognition of their rights. In a sense, Yolngu orchestrate their relationship with outsiders by learning to act in two ways, allowing them to maintain their relative autonomy, yet at the same time accommodate many of the requirements of the encapsulating society. And in so doing, Yolngu have developed means of articulation, which in turn provide the accompanying society with possible modes of adjustment in turn. Minorities incorporated within a nation state need to understand and engage with the dominant society in order to survive. In a sense, both ways is a necessary survival strategy to develop an understanding, in this case, of the European other, while maintaining one's own sense of identity. It's a necessary but not a sufficient strategy. There's much evidence that Aboriginal people throughout Australia's colonial history adopted similar strategies to the Yolngu, but the exigencies of history and the brutal nature of 19th and early 20th century colonialism made it extremely difficult for them to persuade the dominant population to recognise their rights to exist. The relatively late colonisation of Northeast Island land enabled Yolngu to continually insert their own way of doing things into their discourse with the European other. However, rather than seeing Yolngu as an exceptional case, I see their theorisation of their position through the concept of both ways as providing insights into the relative autonomy of regional systems on a global basis, and the necessity of taking this into account when planning for future articulations of local systems within global worlds. Anthropologists share with Yolngu their ability to see the world in two ways, and anthropologists need to use this knowledge both locally and globally. Anthropological research should be able to reveal the durability of local and regional value creation processes and people's capacities to reproduce very different ways of being in the world in dynamic and changing environments. Anthropological understanding enables us to make sense of the longue durée from the local perspective of the societies in place and to understand the process of articulation and their possible consequences. A sermon given in 1958 by the Yolngu leader Burramara to an audience that included the anthropologist Ron Berndt began, "I'm taking this opportunity to explain the duty of anthropologists." He continued, "They come around in order to find out the meaning of our dances, songs, our kinship and so on. All the things we've got and all the things we do. They stand for this, that is their duty. And anthropologists can go all over the place. With this, they hold the world firm." And he then concluded rather over-optimistically, "so that everyone can help one another and be happy." And that's it. that's fine.
Thank you so much for that, Howard. We've got time for a few questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, there we go, in the middle.
Nelson Graeber, UC Berkeley. Thank you, Howard, for another tour de force. On a personal level, I'd just like to ask, was Nancy Williams at this funeral? And in a longer question, were you and she involved in the moiety system? Does it involve the outsiders who have a long-term relationship? Thank you.
Well, you have very good eyes and excellent memory of people. You did indeed see Nancy Williams there. And she was sitting next to Francis Morphy. Absolutely anthropologists, but not just anthropologists. People who have close interaction with Yolngu are incorporated very much into the moiety system. And of course, I'm the opposite moiety to my wife, Frances Morphy. I could actually marry Nancy Williams as well. And it's very interesting, a very interesting example of two-way, because in fact the person, Ms. Unipingu, who died, was Frances's mother and hence my mother-in-law. I had an avoidance relationship with her, and Yolngu take those kind of avoidance relationships very seriously. But they also understand that in the case of Europeans, it's not as easy, in particular if you're moving in the same kind of world. So I move sometimes in the art world with Ms. Unipingu, and I would be asked to do various kinds of things in talking about her work. And Yolngu have developed this formal way of shaking hands with people who have an avoidance relationship, where you go in this particular way, that enables you to, in a sense, acknowledge in a public context that other Europeans around, that you actually know this person and, so on, but still signals the fact that you are behaving according to Yolngu kinship protocols. And absolutely, so I mean, I have to avoid people on the basis of kinship, just as Yolngu have to.
Triloki Pandey from the University of California, Santa Cruz, a brilliant lecture, and it reminded me the kind of impact Warner had on me when I was a graduate student at Chicago during the early 60s. One of the things which I always found anomalous, that Warner, a student of Kroeber at Berkeley, and earlier Radcliffe Brown at Sydney, will end up writing a book about the Australian Aborigines, which he will call A Black Civilization. So is there anything in his writings, except that, where you really have the feeling that he really treated them as civilized peoples?
Completely. Absolutely. It's there in his writing. In particular, he wrote a biography of Harry Mucklewalla that's included in the second edition of Black Civilization, and you really see the closeness of his relationship. But in his letters, Lloyd Warner, writing to other people, said that he was never happier in his life than when he was with Yolngu. Yeah.
Middle lady in the middle.
Thank you, Howard, for that lovely, rich lecture, which I enjoyed enormously. I appreciated the contextualisation you did of Warner's work, but I'd like you to speculate what Phyllis Cabory might have said, given her difference, particularly in issues of gender, from her work in the Kimberleys, and perhaps you could speculate how she might have responded.
Look, I must, first of all, let's begin with an anecdote. Bob Layton was also a student of Phyllis Cabory's. I don't know whether Phyllis said similar things to him, but he was going to the Jura and I was going to Australia. And Phyllis said to me, obviously partly in a humorous manner, my advice to you when you're in the field in Northern Australia. She said, well, one thing every anthropologist should do to take as accompanying reading is the works of Jane Austen. Because that's how you learn about kinship. She also said, though, when I was in the field, I found the most essential thing was a leather bag with holes in it that I could fill with water, hang up over a branch of a tree and have a shower. Now, times had changed when Frances and I were in the field. We no longer had to do that particular enterprise. But I have no doubt that in some ways, what was happening in anthropology over that particular period of time was very much a strong kind of recognition of the sort of role that women had in Aboriginal society, people writing about that particular role. But that's such a complex question. I mean, she was undoubtedly, in her own writing, having Warner, who put a particular Yolngu view of men being sacred or closer to the sacred than women were, as something that she was in dialogue with. But you can very easily get that view if you're Warner working with Yolngu in the 1920s, I suspect, that actually did reflect the ways in which Yolngu would have presented their society to Warner. That's one of the reasons that I say that Warner would have noticed himself changes in Yolngu society, in gender relations over that period of time. It's a really difficult question to answer because it requires so much kind of research in different contexts and different times. Where Phyllis was doing her fieldwork was in a very different environment to the environment that Lloyd Warner was in as well. So you've got a different sort of position in colonial history in those different regions.
The other student.
Mention of Phyllis Cabry, I just want to mention something else that I think she would have noticed and appreciated, and that is the role of anthropologists in helping to further the rights of Aboriginal people. And I know she was very distressed that towards the end of her life, there was a movement in anthropology to criticise her generation for not having been involved in furthering the rights of the people they were studying, and she was deeply hurt by that, and I think she would have greatly appreciated the role that you and Frances have played, and other anthropologists like Nancy Williams have played in advancing, helping the Yolngu to advance their rights, let me put it that way.
I think we must have got to that point of the afternoon, Howard, where it's time for a drink. So let me just close the proceedings by thanking our Huxley lecturer tonight, Sir Howard Morphy, for giving us both a wonderful account of the evolution of his fieldwork along with Frances over the last 40 years, the evolution of a tradition, and also reaffirming for us the value of anthropology. Howard, thank you so much.